Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Room for Discussion. We are joined by Minister Brekelmans today at a time of significant domestic and global uncertainty. In times like these, we are facing urgent challenges that need to be addressed by our leaders. Across Europe and beyond, political, economic, and security challenges will shape the trajectory of the Netherlands, Europe, and the world for years to come.
Since his appointment as minister, Brekelmans has become a key voice in Dutch politics, particularly on foreign affairs and security policies. As the Netherlands navigates a rapidly changing international landscape, questions arise about how we position ourselves in an increasingly uncertain world. How should Europe respond to global power shifts? How do we strike a balance between national interests and European cooperation? And how do we ensure that economic and security policies remain aligned with both our strategic goals and our values?
These topics are all at the very forefront of today's political debate, with strong opinions on how they should be handled. Today, we will talk with the Minister about how he sees the road ahead, the difficult trade-offs that have to be made, and what is needed from leaders in times like these.
And with that, please give a warm welcome to Minister Ruben Brekelmans.
So, welcome, Minister Brekelmans, to Room for Discussion. So to start, at the age of 17, I think most of us were probably just trying to get through high school, maybe figure out dating or getting to a bar. You, on the other hand, were joining the VVD. So we were wondering, have you always known that you wanted to be in politics?
So first of all, thank you for receiving me. And it's a lively context that we are in, but I understand that there are major issues at this point which are, of course, very sensitive. It's about life and death. So I understand that it creates a lot of emotions. But let's try to have a conversation, because I think even if you have different opinions, it's important to exchange views and to sharpen your ideas. I think it's better than try to disrupt a conversation. For me personally, when I was indeed the age of 17, it was a time when there was also a lot of things were happening at the same time internationally. Back then there was also a financial crisis starting in the United States, and then it spilled over to Europe and the Netherlands. And my father just started his own company, and as a small entrepreneur, he faced the direct consequences of this economic crisis that happened in the United States and then spilled over to Europe. And that's what I, as a 17-year-old, was wondering. How is it possible that something that's happening far away is having such a big impact on a small entrepreneur like my dad, just trying to pursue his dream? That was for me a reason to, on the one hand, to decide to study economics, because I wanted to understand how these mechanisms work and what you can do about it. And second, to join the Jongere VVD, the youth VVD, because I realized quite soon, if you want to do something about it, then you need to be in politics, because major decisions are made by politicians. So for me, that was an important time, also in my personal development, and a moment to realize what I wanted to study and also what I wanted to do beside it, and that's politics.
So you've had this long interest, but what makes you the best person to serve in this important position in this turbulent time?
I think what is important now as a Minister of Defense, but also in some other positions, is that you, on the one hand, truly understand the international dynamics, the international context, and that you can translate it into also national support for an agenda. So, for example, when it comes to our international security, I think we need to keep supporting Ukraine. We need to invest more in our military. And I understand this from an international perspective, but you also then need to translate it and bring it close to people in the Netherlands so that they feel the same urgency and the same need to invest more in it. And I think building that bridge between the national context and what's happening in the world, I think that is important. And second, I think what you see in our cabinet is that it's a mix of experiences. So at the Ministry of Defense, my staatssecretaris, vice minister, he has a long military background, also very, he has served many years and also got the highest rewards for this because he has truly deep military experience. But he has less political experience and less experience on the international stage. For me, it's the other way around. So I don't have a military background, but I do have more, I've been a member of parliament, I have more political experience, I've worked for the government, in business, in the international context. So that's what I bring to the table. And I think having these combinations of, deep experience and expertise in substance, combined with people having more political experience, international experience, I think that's very important.
In the run-up to the NATO summit in Washington last July, one message you emphasized was the need to be, quote, a little less liberal when it comes to prioritizing government involvement over the independence of market forces in order to ensure defense readiness. When does a practical reality like that take precedence over perhaps your political values?
Mm-hmm. I think a good example is the defense industry right now. So I started with studying economics. I just told I was reading papers from Professor Beertsma back then. And of course, and I'm a liberal and I'm an economist, so you always think about, how can you make markets work and how can you create the right incentives for an economy to work. What we do see now is that we have a free and an open society with market dynamics, but we are fighting against a dictator in Russia. And we want to strengthen our military capabilities, but one of the key bottlenecks is the capability of our industry to produce on a larger scale and to produce quickly. And then, of course, you can take a step back and see how can you have the market work, but in order to bring supply and demand together, to create the right contracts, to create the right incentives to invest, that takes many, many, many years. And we don't have that time to ramp up our defense production. So that's why I think more active government involvement is needed in order to defend ourselves. But of course, we don't want to copy the Russian model or the Chinese model because we are different, we have different values. So we don't want to copy that, but we need to create our own models to, on the one hand, remain free and to keep the strength of our society, but on the other hand, also to strengthen our military production faster.
Before recent shifts, Dutch defense philosophy was for a long time guided what some people have called a peace dividend, that is reallocation of funds to other measures. Why did this attitude, do you think, persist for so long?
When I was your age, I just told something about my experience with the financial crisis and everything, but another important shaping event was 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I was 15 years old, and in that period, the idea was that the biggest threat was coming from terrorism. So the idea was that one terrorist or a few terrorists can have our biggest security threat than a whole army. And of course, that's also what we saw with 9/11. So the whole idea in those years was that we should not have big armies for countries fighting each other, but that we should have more targeted missions in order to fight terrorism. And that was the reason, of course, for everything we did in Afghanistan, everything we did in Iraq. Of course, there's a lot to be criticized about it, so I don't want to say that that was all good. But the idea was that you need a different type of army because fighting terrorism is the biggest threat. What we do see now, unfortunately, over the last years, is that the threat by big state actors and big militaries has not gone away. So it's a combination now, and the terrorist threat is also not away. So we now need to do everything. It's an accumulation of threats that we are facing now. But it means that we should still have a military that's able to fight terrorism, but also a military that's able to defend ourselves against large-scale straight threats like Russia.
What do you say to those who express doubt about the need to increase the defense budget or question the reality of the situation?
So I look at two things. So one, of course, you always look at the intentions. So what are the so you look at what are the major threats that you are facing. And take, for example, Russia and Putin, you look at two things. One is the intentions. If you look at every speech by Putin, if you look at what he has written, we know that he wants to take revenge. He wants to take revenge for the fact that the Soviet Union has fallen apart and that the big Russian Empire has lost its influence and its territories. So that's, you can see it in the rhetoric, you can see it in everything that he does. You see these intentions. And second, what you look at is the capabilities. And what we see now is that Russia is investing a lot in their military, not only in the short term to fight in Ukraine, but also in the medium to longer term. And if you look at the projections of their military capacity, it's exceeding way beyond what is needed in Ukraine. So then you have this combination of intentions, capabilities, and then you can question, is he willing to be more aggressive against NATO? And I don't think we can be naive about it, because we have seen what Putin is willing to do in Ukraine. So then you have three things: intentions, capabilities, and you know that he is willing to act. And then given the threats that we face, we also need to invest more to make sure that we can defend ourselves against these threats, and that we are able to deter Putin from actually taking that hostile act or taking any further steps against the NATO country.
How would these expenses be funded?
Of course, what you now see is that individual countries are spending more. So in the Netherlands, a few years ago, we were around 1.23%, which is around 10 to 12 billion. And now we are growing in a very short amount of time. We are growing towards 2%, which we now also have put in our legislation, that we should spend at least 2%. And this growth is going in a very short period of time. But what we do see is that NATO has analyzed these threats that I just described. And if you translate it into the military capabilities we need, and then also what type or the cost that it entails, then it's very likely that more than 2% is needed, or even more than 3% is needed. And that's now the political discussion that we will have both internationally and also within the government, is, are we willing with 32 NATO allies to set a new target? And if so, then in the Netherlands, how are we willing to grow towards that target? It's now too early for me to say anything more specific or to make any conclusions, because these conversations are still ongoing.
Does this percentage actually make a difference, or is it just a narrative to make the public feel more secure?
A percentage in itself does not necessarily make a difference, because we have seen in 2014, when we set a new target of 2%, then a big majority of countries were not acting, so they were not growing towards this 2%. But of course, you can use a target also to call on other countries to comply with that target. So it's putting more pressure on the countries that lag behind. But still, you can set a target, but what actually makes a difference is how much you spend, and then to what extent you can turn that spending into capabilities.
I think on this note, we'll continue the conversation elsewhere.
We were talking about defense spending and the 2% NATO targets. As you're mentioning, this is the first time in a while that the Netherlands is projected to reach this NATO goal. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of talk about these numbers. Rutte is calling for 3%, Trump, of course, about 5%. What we were curious about is, would you say that there is a specific number that we ought to be aiming for? And more specifically, what does that spending look like in practice?
I think the most important in the upcoming months towards the NATO summit in The Hague is that we as NATO, with 32 countries, show unity. And the most important thing is that at the NATO summit, we will have a joint declaration between 32 countries, which also show and project unity towards Russia and towards other adversaries. if you look at the threats that we are facing from Russia, but also others, and if we in the medium to long term want to defend ourselves against it, then we need more military capabilities. We need to scale up. And if you then translate that into how much should countries spend, then we see that NATO and also the Secretary General of NATO say that it's more than 2% and probably more than 3%. That's based on their analysis. What we are going to do now in the next couple of months is to see, can we bring 32 countries together towards a common goal? And it's not going to be an easy discussion, because if you look at the differences between countries, it's pretty big. You still have a group of countries which are around 1.5%, and you have, for example, Poland, which is above 4%, and you have the biggest and the most important country in NATO, the United States, saying it should be even 5%. So this is the kind of the playing field where we are at with 32 countries, and I think what we will try to do is to bring those countries together towards one joint goal. But what exact percentage that's going to be and what year it's going to be, because it also makes a difference if you set a goal for 4000, for example, 2035 or 2030 or even sooner. It's all still unclear, because the positions of different countries are so far away from each other.
We'll come back to this point about unity within the alliance in a moment, but first I'd like to ask about the defense manufacturing base. If we're spending all this money as the Netherlands, as other countries in NATO, in the EU, the defense manufacturing base is quite fragmented. You know, we have companies operating their own national silos. How can we use these expenditures more efficiently?
That's true. It's too fragmented at this point. What we should do much more is to bring the demand of different countries together. If you aggregate demand, then you get bigger size, and also for the defense industry, it becomes easier to make new investments, to set up new facilities, new production lines. And we have some mechanisms to aggregate demand, for example, through NATO or through some of the EU institutions that we have. But it's working sometimes. There are some good examples. For example, there is going to be a new Patriot missile facility, so a facility which is going to produce thousands of those missiles that Ukraine is now using to defend itself against air attacks by Russia. This is going to be set up in the south of Germany. This new production line. This is a good example, because there were 4 countries, including the Netherlands, that put their demand together, and that was providing enough skill for a manufacturer to say, I will add another production line. But this is just one example, and there are a few of examples more, but what we need is that this becomes more common standard. So if we as the Netherlands or any other country wants to buy something, we should check within the EU and within NATO, are there any other countries that are asking for the same thing? Can we bring that demand together and then have quickly come to a contract with the defense industry? But this is currently, it's still taking way too much time, because countries, and also including the Netherlands, I need to be honest, are still approaching this too much from a national perspective, looking at national interest. And given the urgency of the threats that we face, we should be able to transcend those national interests.
Is that fragmentation posing a security threat to Europe right now?
It's hindering us. It's hindering us to speed up. It's hindering us to scale up, and we should, you know, we will not change it completely overnight. But as I said, we only now have a few positive examples, and we should have many more. And these what are now examples should become more the standard, and that's requiring something from all of us. And I do think in the end, given the investments that we are going to make, if we are able to grow the pie quicker, then every country is able to get a big slice from it. And then we will, in the end, we will all benefit, both from a security perspective, because we will get more military capabilities, and also from an economic perspective, because if you invest in your defense industry, it's creating more jobs, it creates a lot of innovation, also both from a technological and science perspective. So I think in the end we will all benefit, both for our security and also economically.
So continuing on this topic of security threats, so something that's a very pressing concern right now is the possibility of the Trump administration playing member states off against each other on matters of security policy, which is something that can be avoided to a much greater extent in conversation about trade policy. So where the EU is one big entity. So is that a pressing concern for you at the moment?
I think of course, Trump has just started, but he is going ahead at full speed, especially in terms of the statements that he's making. And myself and also my colleagues and everyone, we ask all the time, what is your opinion on the statement by Trump or that statement by anyone else from the American administration? I think a few things are important. One is that we talk more with the US administration than about the US administration. So now that they are all inaugurated, that also the teams are, that some of the civil servants that are working for the ministers and the president are now also getting into positions. It also enables us to really work with them and not only talk about them. Second, I think sometimes when a statement is made, we should also look at what is the underlying message. So take, for example, Greenland. The fact that there are some concerns about this area where there are a lot of resources, where we see more geopolitical competition from Russia, also from China. And so the underlying message that we should look differently at it, that we should look more at it from a security perspective. I think that's a valid point. And we can have a conversation about it. And Denmark is also investing much more in it to be able to be military present there.
So you get into this point about Greenland, which is of course the most pressing area of this right now. So given this new reality of what we're facing and the currently quite weak framework of their common foreign and security policy, how could Europe develop a shared strategy in response to things like these?
Yeah, so I think one third point that I wanted to make is that, and that's related to your question, is that sometimes you need to make clear what you stand for. So in this case, for example, we as the Netherlands and also others, sovereignty and territorial integrity, those are key principles, and that's what we also make clear. That's what we stand for. On the other hand, if we openly argue with the United States or any other country within NATO, then it also projects division and does project a lack of unity. And what I just said, what we need in these times, given the big threats we face from Russia and also the assertiveness by China, we need to project more unity. And that creates a dilemma sometimes. So sometimes we will, I think we need to make clear, the values and the principles we stand for. But sometimes it's also better to say, I won't react publicly because it's better to have this conversation behind the scenes and to make sure that we, towards the rest of the world, that we project unity. And that's something we need to look at a case-by-case basis.
I mean, you mentioned about we should look at the underlying picture of what Trump's statements were about Greenland, but we should take him seriously and literally sometimes about the way he does it. How can Europe hedge against the risk of what he said about NATO, what he said in this case about Greenland? Should Europe be hedging against that risk?
I think we need to look at it, as I said, on a case-by-case basis, but quite often there is we need to take such a statement seriously in the sense that there is a point there. So, for example...
Is that not wishful thinking to see it in that light?
It really depends. So if it is about, for example, Greenland, the fact that in that area we see more Russian activity, more Chinese activity, that we need to invest more in our capabilities for the Arctic, that's a valid point. I agree. So we need to seriously look at it. When it comes to spending, defense spending, the point that Trump is making that European countries should do more, that we need to invest more, that we need to make sure that we are not fully dependent on some strategic capabilities by the United States, that's a valid point. Where I do disagree, if territorial integrity comes under threat, or if Article 5, which is the pillar of NATO, the key foundation of NATO, if that's under threat. So I think that's what we constantly need to look at. Is it a valid point? Is there something valid there? Okay, let's discuss about it. Let's talk about it. Let's see what we can do, what European countries can do more. But if there are certain principles at stake that are key to our security and key to our way of life and our freedom, of course, then we should be open and also make clear what our position is.
One way in which this is becoming more concrete right now is that the European Commission is expected to publish a white paper on the future of European defence next month.
So we were curious, what are the strategic interests that are most pressing for you to defend this new project?
On behalf of the Netherlands.
Yeah.
So a few priorities. One is what we just discussed. We need to make sure that we increase our defense production quickly, because currently when I have more budget, we see that only the prices are going up. And in the end, when for example, my budget increases by 20%, but also price increase by 20%, then I don't have anything more at the end of the day. So that's an issue. We need to increase the production so that not price but quantity is going up. And at the end of the day, that we have more military capabilities to defend ourselves. That's one. Second, and that's also strategically important, is that if we invest as the EU or with European countries, we should remain open towards our partners outside of the EU. So, for example, if you look at our Air Force, we have many, our F-35s, our fighter jets, but also many other systems. It's very much interconnected with American manufacturers. So if we want to increase the production and scale up, then we need to have American manufacturers on board. But when it comes to air defense, for example, the same is with Norwegian manufacturers, so non-EU, the British partners, so we need to have those non-EU countries on board as well. That's the second priority. And third, what we also sometimes see is that we want to expand as military here in the Netherlands. We simply need more space to do training, to do exercises, to do all sorts of activities. And sometimes regulations, for example, environmental regulations, are standing in our way. And what we do see is that quite often those are European regulations. And then we also need to look closely at, do we need exemptions for defense and for national security? My colleague from Estonia said, of course, Natura 2000, so those environmental areas are very important. Yeah. But if Putin is approaching you, he will not stop because it's in a Natura 2000 area. So we also need to be very open and say, okay, of course those environmental regulations are there for a reason and we should respect them as much as we can, but sometimes we need to have an exemption for our defense, for our national security, because that's currently really at stake, and we need to also have those exemptions on a European level.
So to broaden from just the European Union discussion, the Washington Summit declaration signed at the last year's NATO summit emphasized continued support for Ukraine on its, quote, irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership. So should Europe be pushing for NATO or EU membership, for that matter, for Ukraine, or at least a promise of one?
So I think that statement was important because we not only said, that Ukraine in the future can become a member of NATO, which has been said since 2008, but if you make a statement with 32 countries saying that they're on a irreversible path, I think that was a strong statement. I think what we are working on right now is to make sure that also their military becomes more, as it's called, interoperable, so it gets closer to NATO standards. So, for example, we are delivering F-16s to Ukraine. What we do is that we not only deliver those fighter jets, we also deliver spare parts, we deliver ammunition, we also train their pilots. We set up a training center in Romania, a European training center where Ukrainian pilots are trained. We also train and educate engineers, so they are able to sustain those F-16s. And in that way, we help them to make their air force compatible with NATO standards. So they transition from the old Soviet fighter jets and the whole system that is behind it to a NATO compliant system with the F-16s. And this is a key example in which the Netherlands is helping Ukraine more practically towards NATO membership in the future. And I know that other countries are doing the same as well. So I think those steps are now very important. Second, apart from that, is of course the whole discussion about if there are negotiations at some point this year around Ukraine, then of course we need to have Ukraine at the table. If it's about Europe, we need to have Europe at the table. But Ukraine will also ask for some security guarantees. And how do those security guarantees look like? But of course that's a separate discussion, and we need to wait and see, how that's going to progress over the next few months and this year.
So this integration of Ukraine into Western institutions really, at the same time, poses a series of challenges whether politically, economically, or on a security level. It could accelerate fractures within NATO or the EU, even provoke a more dangerous response from Russia. How should Europe and the Netherlands be navigating these issues?
Yeah, so I think we need to. So there are two things. So one is you can make statements, of course, and I said, the statement in Washington was quite clear about the irreversible path. Then you can, of course, argue, okay, another statement should be made, or any further, or more on a strategic level or a political level, further progress should be made. But you can also look at the practical work that needs to be done. And I mentioned the example of the Air Force and the F-16s, and there are many others as well. Same is true for the EU membership. So if we help, of course we can make further statements and things like that, but if we help Ukraine to fight corruption, to work on rule of law, to also to keep their economy running and to make sure that their macro financial stability remains intact, I think we also help them in a very practical way to get closer to the EU and to get closer to NATO. So the help them on a more practical level, I think, is what we should do anyways, and we do that in the military domain, we do that in other domains as well, and that's very good. And if the time is right to make further steps on a political and on a strategic level, we need to wait and see if that's going to take place this year. It's very hard to say because we have, like, for example, the United States, it's not very clear still what their view is. We have elections in Germany, of course, and a new German administration might also have a clear opinion on this. So it's a bit hard to say now how much, what further steps can we expect.
Europe should take the lead in any peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, as you recently stated in an interview with Trau. Now, why is that so crucial? Or stated differently, how could we push for an end to the war on Europe's terms?
So what I said is that first and foremost priorities is to make sure that Ukraine has a stronger position at the battlefield. Because if Ukraine is pushed to negotiate from a position of weakness, then you will probably get a bad deal, and that's not only negative for Ukraine, but it's also negative for Europe and also the rest of the world, because it will encourage Russia and also others to use aggression as a tool to pursue their goals. That's one. But second, what we do see is that Trump said during the campaign and at other moments is that he wants to negotiate quickly, that he wants to enter into negotiations soon with Russia.
Would that not bypass Europe or Ukraine?
And that was my point. So if that happens, if we do see that that's happening, then we first and foremost need to make sure that Ukraine is sitting at the table, because they need to decide on what terms they want to negotiate, and negotiation to take place because it's about Ukraine. And second, it's quite likely that if negotiations take place, it will not only be about Ukraine, but it will also be about the security architecture in Europe. And if that's the case, then I think that Europe should sit at the table as well. You don't want Ukraine, Russia, the US to decide about Europe. Then Europe needs to be there as well.
But who's calling the shots for Europe? Quote Kissinger, who do I want to call if I want to speak to Europe?
No, that is a good question. That is a good question. And that's, of course, that question is still relevant for the EU nowadays, because we do see, of course, that in some countries there are elections. We do see that there is just a new EU Commission, not with the same, of course, with Ursula von der Leyen still heading the Commission, so that's clear, but also with the new head of the European Council. And we do see that there are a lot of changes within Europe when it comes to the people that are leading. So we do need to see who's the best then to sit at the table, and you can think of different constructions. But I think the principle should be that if there are major geopolitical discussions on security in Europe, then Europe should always sit at the table. That was the point that I tried to make in the interview.
To move the focus a little bit, we know that after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Europe was confronted with a harsh reality about the consequences of energy dependence on Russia. We were wondering how are energy policy and security issues interwoven, and what does that picture look like today for the Netherlands?
It is very much interconnected. It's true for energy. It's also true for other economic activities. We do see that everything, resources, for example, strategic resources, it becomes all much more interconnected with security. And we do see that because our adversaries, for example, Russia, are using it as a lever, as a tool to put pressure on us. And on the other hand, if we want to use sanctions, then also it's very much, the degree in which we can use sanctions is very much dependent on our position. So if we are dependent on Russia, for example, when it comes to energy, then it becomes much harder to put sanctions on energy supplies by Russia than if you have alternatives. Yeah. And I think over the last 3 years we made great progress as the EU. If you look at our imports when it comes to gas, we found alternatives. We switched to more renewable energy, LNG. We are using much more from the United States and other places. I think Norway is producing much more, of course, which is a safe country to work with. But we are not there yet. And we see that some countries within Europe are still, to a large extent, are using Russian gas. We also see that sanctions are circumvented. So, of course, there's the issue with the shadow fleet that we should try to fight against and to enforce the sanctions that we put in place. So it remains also a constant battle to see, are there any loopholes? Is Russia finding ways to circumvent those sanctions? And if so, how can we close those avenues and to make sure that those sanctions are enforced?
Von der Leyen has called for buying more LNG from the US, but is trading one reliance for another a particularly smart move here?
Of course, in the end, it's better to make sure that you have alternatives in which you are not dependent on someone, but if you have multiple partners that you trade with, you can, to a large extent, can produce, for example, renewable energy or nuclear energy, can produce yourself. But the reality is that you do not get there from one day to the other. And at this point, in our economy and in our heating of our housing and everything, we still need gas. And for very good reasons, we stopped using gas from Groningen. So then we need to look at other countries, and then only the production from Norway is not enough. So you also need to look at others, the United States, but also a country like Qatar, for example.
Or Azerbaijan.
We in the Netherlands, we do not use that much gas from Azerbaijan. I think it's more southern European countries. But that's the reality, if you only say you want to work with countries that have exactly the same values as we, then there are not enough suppliers. So we need to then also work together with some partners that, some inconvenient partners, but we should not I think we should not import from our enemy. And we are fighting a war. Ukraine is now fighting a war against Russia. We are supporting Ukraine. So we should try to avoid as much as we can that we at the same time give funds to Russia by buying their gas.
Some EU officials were quoted in the Financial Times recently saying that we should resume Russian gas imports as a concession in potential Ukraine peace talks. Would that make them an inconvenient partner?
No, I don't think. I think we should keep the pressure on Russia, and I think if we as Europe now start buying Russian gas again, I think that would cause a lot of relief. But I don't want to speculate about relief for Russia, because of course we see that their economy is now under pressure. We see that their government revenues are under pressure, and if we now, as Europe, would say, okay, we import Russian gas again, that would provide them a lot of economic relief, so to say, and fiscal relief. But I don't want to speculate about any negotiations because those talks haven't started yet. I haven't seen any plans or strategy or whatever. So yeah, I don't think that I'm in a position now to speculate about it. But at least in the foreseeable future, I would say let's continue maximum pressure on Russia and help Ukraine as much as we can so that they are in a position of strength.
To shift the focus a little bit again, migration is an issue that is increasingly tied to questions of border control, counterterrorism, and hybrid threats. As we have seen in the last decade in deals between the EU and neighboring countries such as Turkey and Tunisia, we've also seen the weaponization of migrants most prominently by Belarus on the Polish border, More recently, Finland has accused Russia of the same. So is migration inseparable from questions of national security?
Not anymore, for the reasons that you mentioned, and I think especially that the weaponizing of migrants, I think that's a very difficult one because people are abused and used as a tool by Russia and by Belarus. So you see that people from, for example, Iraq and other places are brought in by plane, and then they are basically pushed over the border and in the forest. So they are used as tools. And the dilemma is, of course, if you say, okay, those people, they are in a very vulnerable position at that point. But if you let them in, then you know that Russia and Belarus will do it even more. So then you bring new groups and larger numbers of people in that vulnerable position. So I think it is a good thing and a good decision to say, okay, in those cases where people are in that way abused and used as a weapon or a tool to put us under pressure, then you need to have different regulations than when a true refugee is crossing the border and asks for asylum in Europe. I think it's good that also in the European migration regulations that there is now this separate legislation when it comes to the weaponization of migrants.
Here in the Netherlands, your government has recently pushed for an asylum crisis with the stated intention of implementing strict asylum regime measures and asked for an opt-out in the 2023 EU Pact on Migration. Does this sort of action, this sort of language on a domestic level, does that undermine efforts on a broader European level to address these security measures being taken against weaponization of migrants?
No, I don't think so, because I think it's two separate questions. So you have the one question is what Belarus and Russia are doing, so flying in people and then pushing over the border, so really using people as a tool, and I think you need to have the right regulations for that, and there is quite broad consensus within the EU about this, because we all want, we don't want this to happen. And the second question is if there is, there are wars around Europe, or if there's poverty or whatever, and people decide to come to the Netherlands and to Europe, then how do you deal with that? And how do you make sure that the people that are true refugees because they are in danger and that they get a safe place somewhere? And how do you distinguish them from people who are looking for a better future maybe, but are not fleeing for war or for personal persecution? And that's a separate question.
Does this sort of language, though, have tangible consequences in making our country safer?
What do you mean, sorry?
This sort of language of asylum crisis, we want an opt-out, does that have tangible consequences? I understand there's two separate issues, but speaking of migration in a broader sense, especially as linked to security.
So I think what's, when you look at asylum, I think what was positive is that after many years of discussion, there is now a European Asylum Pact, but it's there only on paper. And individual countries have, I think, until 2026 to implement it. And that requires a lot of work from every country. And what we have seen in the past, also on migration, but also other topics, is that you can decide on something on a European level, but maybe some member states do not implement those EU regulations, and then it's not working because it's a system that you create with 27 countries together. So our statement that, if those regulations do not work and do not have an impact, in that case, we would be willing to do an opt-out. I think it puts some pressure on other countries to really implement those EU regulations. So it can also help in realize the effects that we want to see.
Right. So slowly rounding off this interview, these issues that are shaping our safety around us, I think to a lot of people in today's society can feel like an abstraction. But in many places, this is becoming increasingly real. In the Nordic countries, for example, leaflets have recently been distributed to all citizens with information on how to act in the event of war or other crisis. So we were wondering, what should the individual citizen here in the Netherlands do to be prepared for such a scenario?
Yeah, so I think it's three things. So one, we said that everyone needs to realize that we do not live in war, luckily, but we also do not live in peace. And it is because we see that Russia is posing a bigger military threat to our alliance, but also because of the hybrid activities, so cyber attacks, espionage, sabotage, and that can impact our daily lives when, for example, electricity is taking out or when our internet is not working anymore. So people can prepare on an individual level to make sure that they are resilient at home, so that they are prepared for those crisis scenarios, and not only to be prepared yourself, but also your friends, your family, people in your street that are maybe older people that are more vulnerable. That you make sure in your direct environment, what can I do in order to make sure that myself and the people around me do not panic. That's one. Second is that you need to look at the organization where you are working. It can be a company, it can be a financial institution, maybe a local government, whatever. Is your organization prepared for those type of crisis scenarios? For example, electricity not working, or no access to the internet, things like that. Everyone can ask that him or herself. And third, is there anything else that you can do for the military and to help our resilience and to help our military preparedness? What we are also looking for, we're looking at many more reservists. So if you look at Finland and other countries, we see that they have a military, but on top of that, they have huge number of reservists that can help in situations in which it is needed. And we in the Netherlands, we also want to have many more of those reservists. So it's basically, the question is to everyone, please ask yourself what you can do to make the Netherlands more resilient and to have our military to become better prepared. You can do that on the individual level, you can do that in your organization, but you can also do that by, helping the military one way or the other.
You grew up and now you live back in Brabant, far removed from the political scene in The Hague. When you're back there talking with old friends or walking through your hometown, what worries you about the future of the Netherlands? What gives you hope? Brandt er nog licht?
No, when I'm in Brabant, where I feel at home, it is of course, I realize perfectly why we are doing all this, because I want to preserve the way of living that we have in the Netherlands and in this place that I call home and where I feel at home. So people growing up in a free way, they can decide to pursue their dreams and they can start a business, or you can, you have the freedom to decide to do what you want. And also it's on an individual level, but also for us as a country, that we can decide our own direction. That is so fundamental, and we see that after 80 years of freedom, after Second World War, we are celebrating this in the year 2025. That basic freedom that is making me, my family, everyone in my village in Brabant, but also in the rest of the Netherlands, is making happy, or is allowing us to be happy. That freedom is increasingly under pressure, and we should invest in our military. We should invest in our defense, in our resilience, to make sure that we keep that freedom, and that we will not, stay at 80 years, but that we will reach 100 years, and even much further into the future, that we are able to remain a free and happy country, and that's what we are working on.
Thank you very much for joining us here today.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for continuing the conversation up here. I think it's important to us here at Room for Discussion to be a place for conversation and fruitful debate. I'm so glad you could join us and continue that conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.